Hello, business innovators and educators. You're listening to The Enterprise Learning Architect. I'm your host, Chris Knotts, here to guide you through practices and ideas you can use to help build a culture of learning in your organization. Stay tuned to power up your professional playbook as we have conversations with exceptional people who share their experience in achieving successful learning outcomes. Ready to innovate, educate, and iterate? Let's do it. In today's episode of the Enterprise Learning Pod, Toby and I are back to discuss the many ways learning plays an important role in effective product management. If you listened to our conversation about lean product testing, you'll hear us expand on a lot of the themes that we touched on in that episode. We also give shout outs to a few of the people I look up to the most when it comes to fundamental product management principles, including the kind of startup mentality championed by folks like Paul Graham and Eric Ries. We talk a bit about some of the most useful metrics to employ in the early stages of a product launch, when to start managing a product that no longer qualifies as new, why shortening your cycle time drives down cost and risk, and other general pontifications that we hope you'll find interesting. Hope you enjoy the discussion, and remember, always be learning. All right, hey everybody, welcome back to the Enterprise Learning Pod. Today, Toby's going to facilitate the conversation, and we're going to talk about some of the relationships between learning and product management in general. So if you heard our conversation on lean product testing, there are some relationships there, but I thought it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about product management as a general discipline and how important learning is to weave into that discipline. And there's a lot of relationships and touch points as well. So anyway, Toby, you're going to play host today, and we'll have a chat about this.
Sounds great. Welcome back to the pod, everybody. It's nice to be back on again as the facilitator. How you doing this week, Chris? How was Houston?
Houston was good, full bore with the final stretch of a big project that is actually quite relevant to today, although we won't talk about it too much because we're dealing with NDAs and so forth. But it's been good, yeah. And then vacation last week, so that was a nice break. September at the beach is always lovely, so enjoyed that. But back to work very hard here, and yeah, pretty much the du jour.
All right, let's hop on it. Um, First, always best to start right at the beginning. Let's talk about the principles of product management and how they align with our learning design and delivery.
Yeah, wow. So, I mean, you could write a book on that question, but in the interest of trying to, let's just see if we can't kind of put our finger on some of the core nuggets here. So, I guess the first thing I would say is product management is a profession unto itself. And enterprise learning has a number of professions all to themselves as well. So let's talk a little bit about product management first as a discipline. And we'll start bringing the learning in right away because essentially there's a few different schools of thought on product management as a job role. And so there's one that's kind of conventional. It's like a product line manager, and depending on how technical or involved or domain specific your product is, there may be like quite a lot of specific engineering considerations, and you may even have to kind of be an engineer if the product requires that level of knowledge. And that's the conventional sort of traditional product lifecycle there is quite waterfall, very heavy on design, front end design, specifications, and things like that. And so it's really oriented around like blueprinting and designing the like actual tangible product. So in situations like that, learning plays a role because obviously you've got to have a lot of expertise coming into something like that. So you have already learned a lot, right? And there's other dimensions of learning there too, but for now I'll just kind of put a pin in that one, and then we'll move on to some of the other product management sort of dimensions, right? So then getting into a little bit more of a contemporary landscape, product management, and this is usually how you hear it discussed in the market these days, product management is usually referring a little bit more to often something that has a heavy reliance on software or technology components. So the software product lifecycle is kind of a mini subset of product management, which has some unique characteristics. And a lot of this is dealt with in the agile movement and things like that. And that's probably a conversation unto itself. But that is really more about what are the team practices that you set up, A product manager or a product owner in that case is kind of a linchpin of a certain workflow. It's really about managing that workflow and owning it, being a liaison between your end user and customer, and then what the people building your product are doing. So in a situation like that, you may have very little technical expertise around what the product is. Your real full-time job and where your expertise lies is in kind of an understanding of how the product lifecycle works across different phases and with different stakeholders and things like that. So learning is really important in that type of a situation because it's fundamentally an agile process. And so you're kind of iterating on development, getting some feedback from users or from stakeholders, and then you're baking that right in. And so, we begin to get really close kissing cousins in terms of how we treat the learning life cycle with the product development life cycle in a situation like that. So that's kind of like modern product management, especially for technology dependent products. And, there's a whole movement underway to actually transition sort of many of the strategic pillars of how organizations manage their value chain and things like that are like really product forward. They put the product kind of first and foremost is like a central guiding principle of the way they manage the business and deliver value. And learning is really important to that because it's fundamentally iterative. It's iterative like at the team level, it's iterative at the portfolio level, and then it's iterative at the level of the product itself because the products are kind of dynamic, and they're like service. They're really more like
Mm.
services a lot of times. The idea of a product versus a service really bleeds back and forth a lot more in that kind of a situation than it might would in like traditional economics or something like that. And then the third and final piece that I'll talk about is a little bit more in like a kind of an entrepreneurial context. So if you imagine like a startup who is being funded a PE or VC capital or something like that, uh, in a situation like that, learning is absolutely fundamental to how the product is managed because at least depending on what your philosophy is but there's a real uptick in appetite for the philosophy that actually launching or standing up and scaling a new business is intimately entwined with the product itself and how you sort of go to market is really more of like an experimentation type of thing. And so it actually standing up and launching a new business and a new product is basically one and the same with like a learning life cycle. So you really have to understand that learning life cycle, and it informs how you adjust the product and how you read the market and how you're kind of like you're playing like real time ball in terms of having learning processes baked into both the product life cycle but also just the way you run the business so that you can sort of detect and learn as you go about what users and customers want, and then you're able to very quickly adapt the product to meet that. Like a trope in startup world, especially technology products or services, is that basically the product that you make 50 or $100 million with is probably not even going to look very much like the beginning product that you go to market with, because you're going to learn so much and change what you're doing along the way. And in some cases, the end product, like that you make those, you reach that. Three-figure million mark or something like that. I mean, it doesn't even resemble what you first started the venture with. So learning is like totally fundamental to that cycle. So I hope that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And we're talking about the startup industry here. You're saying that, what you're going to market with looks nothing like what is going to be your fundamental success because of all of the learning involved with that. And, in the current state of how, the startup industry is looking, especially in the tech sector, a little stretched, a little harder to find money. A lot of places are focusing on a more a lean startup setup. It's very important to be able to use what little venture capital money is available to stretch it as far as you can. Can you expand a little bit more about that, about how the lean startup methodology influences your approach to designing and managing those learning programs?
Yeah, sure. I love that question. So, you can't talk about this without giving some props to Eric Ries, who literally kind of wrote the first and really famous book. It's called The Lean Startup. And he talks a lot about actually implementing the types of ideas that I talked about in the third scenario just then. But there are some really important ideas there, and this idea that basically you've got to get out to market and learn your market and learn how to adapt your product. It's really fundamental. And in the episode we did on lean product testing, I cited a lot of those ideas as well. So you'll hear a lot of those themes reflected here. But in the lean startup, what Eric describes is basically a little bit of it's like a framework for um, reducing your barrier to entry to a new market, or the introduction of a new product, so that it's as fast and as inexpensive as possible, thus the lean thing. But he also understands that if you're doing as much as you can with as little as possible, the purpose of those initial market cycles is just to learn. So you've kind of got to have a command of this concept of learning agility, and iterative learning, and how it relates to cycle time with product management, because the early phases of that lean startup life cycle are essentially like just learning cycles. You're not really trying to make big money at all. You're just trying to get some engagement with the market so that you can collect feedback. And so Eric in the lean startup describes this cycle of kind of like launching an MVP, collecting some feedback, learning, adjusting, uh, and then going out to market with another iteration of it. And then crucially, one of the important ideas that is in that book and kind of in that market approach is this idea that one of the things it's a little bit of an art form is that at some point in that cycle, you have to reach a point called the pivot or persevere. So you'll hear this phrase, pivot or persevere, and that's kind of like the moment when you really have to decide: have I collected enough data? Have I collected enough user behavior? Do I have enough confidence in the product at this particular level of maturity that I really believe if I pour a lot more resources into it and invest, and like it's really a commitment moment. And at some point, you can't just do lean startup in the early phases forever, right? Like you're not really going to make any money that way. So it's a phase that you have to go through. But the whole goal of the lean startup cycle, in which it's like this circular diagram of test, learn, adapt, is to reach that point of either pivoting or persevering, in which you kind of abandon the old version and do
Mhm.
a significant adaptation or a significant pivot, or yep, I've collected enough data, I've learned enough to understand that this is the candidate that's going to become the primary product that we focus on, and we're going to pour resources into that, and we're really going to go hard on that product. But fundamentally, the lean startup idea is all about like essentially baking a learning modality into the early product testing, if you will. It's essentially like a test, learn, and iterate cycle. But yes, at some point, the goal there is to essentially discover the version of your product that's going to win. And you have to be comfortable with the idea that no matter how smart you are, the market is just a really dynamic, big, chaotic jungle, and you never really can predict exactly like what people want. And so you have to have kind of a disciplined discovery process there. But the goal is to discover enough to where you have a firm understanding of the product that's actually going to be successful.
Absolutely, and I mean that's the name of the game. I fundamentally this applies to outside the learning business. Any sort of successful business is looking for the version of them that's the win. That's the best version of success. And you know, as we say in the enterprise learning pod, innovate, educate, iterate, right? And
Exactly.
you were just talking that feedback loop. You put it out there, you get feedback, you iterate, and you just have to do that. How do you do that? How do you incorporate that feedback loop from the product management? How do you incorporate it into the learning processes? How did you make the learning processes effectively, affect your product management?
That's a great question. And so I want to give like a very short version of an answer, but then I want to go off on a little bit of a tangent. But before I go on the tangent, you can't
Yeah,
imagine
that.
that. Yeah,
Yeah, what?
how could we do that?
How
Although
could we tangent?
I've been thinking lately we should probably do more tangents on this pod. I think we're a little too buttoned up sometimes. So
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you've been warned.
Get David Manica back up in this. We get the go
Yeah,
off the
we'll get
rails all the
David's
time.
the king. He's the king of tangents, but there's always some juicy nuggets in there. So anyway, so how do you do it? It's all about Toby. It's all about how you set up your workflow practices. So it's not as much a product design template. It's you could even argue that it's not as much a product management template. It's a product ownership template. If everybody is investing their work life and often quite a bit of capital, and they're trying to either scale or maintain or improve an existing product, depending on what um, like point of maturity that a particular product is at in its life cycle, which is a really important idea, actually, like just kind of understanding the product life cycle. And that kind of harkens back to um, the conventional product management that's cited in the title of this pod episode, right? Like that stuff is really important. It's important to understand market dynamics, addressable markets. It's important to understand customer personas and user personas and like all the things that go along with sort of like vanilla product management that you understand. But if you're gonna start, especially on the newer or earlier side of the product lifecycle, that's where it's really important to bake in this learning vis-a-vis the product itself. Now, um, it's interesting to think about different points in the product lifecycle, because if you have an at-scale product that is, what we might sometimes call a cash cow, or like you've connected the clutch to the market, you've scaled it up, you're making a lot of money and things like that. It's still important to employ that iterative learning lifecycle, but you're not employing that focused as much on like how are we really going to transform or pivot to a new version of the product. You're directing that same learning lifecycle then at like the production side of your product operations. How can we tinker around and find efficiencies? How can we strengthen relationships of our vendors, and how can we find more customer delight and things like that with the product that we've already got as a winner? So you're still employing like an iterative learning life cycle. It's just not as much about finding a product because you found it at that point. But once you found it, you've got to figure out on an ongoing basis how to maintain it, and how to keep it healthy, and how to keep that customer your customer base healthy and engaged and things like that. So it's fundamentally the same iterative learning process, but it looks different depending on where you are in the maturity of your product life cycle. You got a $500 million product or something. That's going to look a little different than if you're in that lean startup phase. But you can apply a lot of the logic of the lean startup stuff to at scale products. So anyway, that's a mini rant on product maturity and the product life cycle. But to get back to your question, how do you build it in? You build it in with the design of your experiments. So if you think about sort of how you might bake a cake, say, right? Like there's a lot of different kinds of cake you can bake. They look all kinds of different ways. They taste all kinds of different ways. They're used for all kinds of different occasions. Like you have a whole bunch of different um, end products that you might want to create depending on what the situation is. But if you think about being a good baker, there's fundamental principles there. There's ideas around ratios of ingredients and things like that. You get what I'm saying, right? So like it's the fundamental ingredients and ratios and like baseline baker skills. If you were to think about the analogy of that in terms of like an iterative, uh, constantly learning, always be improving sort of disciplined work cycle. It's about the way that you arrange the roles on the team, and it's about how you organize and prioritize things. So that's really, I think, first and foremost. You can't do all the things, so you have to get really good at prioritization. And prioritization is a point when a lot of times things fall apart because people have differing opinions, and if there's not data to figure out how to quantify or measure the value of different decisions, then it's just a bunch of roundtable talk and your bike shedding things. And there's what gets prioritized essentially comes down to either who has the most clout because they're the highest paid person in the room. They're the boss, and at the end of the day, it's their opinion that matters. That's a really bad way. It's the kind of the anti-pattern of building disciplined learning into product management, like we're talking about. So designing things like experiments, designing things like team cadence and how the work flows through. Also, designing KPIs and OKRs is really important because the what you're actually measuring and what those KPIs and OKRs are, that's a little bit like the end cake. Like they're going to be different depending on what the application is. But you absolutely have to design KPIs and OKRs that align to what the goal is. Well, the goal is going to be dynamic, right? Like there's all kinds of different goals depending on the situation. So it's all about kind of understanding what are the things that I'm going to do the same way for the same amount of time every time, but with an understanding that I might be baking a cheesecake for my mom's birthday in one situation, or I might be baking a wedding cake for a friend's wedding reception in another situation. Those are very different situations, um, and it's kind of the same with the arrangement of the life cycle, right? So if you if you have the fundamentals, and the fundamentals are things like prioritizing backlogs, also management of the team. So, sort of how the roles are arranged on the team and how you manage those roles, how they interact together. You're essentially building like a little learning organization with that team. So, there's principles that are always going to be in common no matter what the life cycle looks like, and there's kind of roles that are always going to be in common, but what you're pointing those roles and feedback cycles and development cycles, what the KPIs and OKRs are actually there to measure. Those things vary, but the fact that you're employing all of those tools does not vary. So that hopefully kind of answers your question, right? You've got to have a leg to stand on. You've got to balance the need for consistency and a repeatable framework, with the idea that the product of that framework is going to vary depending on what the needs in the situation is. I hope that answers the question a little bit. And I still haven't done my rant, but I'm going to stop talking for a minute to give you a chance.
Absolutely, no, 100%. I've been kind of looking to jump in here because for a lot of us, it's nice to know about the theory and all, and like of course you're talking about the name of the game, you're getting it, but in the real world, it gets messy. It gets hard to cleanly translate these principles into action. And so I was wondering if you could maybe shift towards a real life example where you iterative iteratively developed something that wasn't working into something that did.
Yeah, man. I mean, that's really the substantive question, right? If you can answer that question well, then you've got something real there. So I guess an example from my own career that I could talk about. Obviously, I've really built a lot of learning products and things over the years, but I've also been heavily involved in developing some platforms and some software, and even the oddball physical product here and there as well. But one example that I guess I could talk about a little bit was, not all that long ago. We were at an inflection point in my organization around how we could scale. We had gotten a little bit beyond the point of product discovery. Now, it's important to note that product discovery was still happening so that we could find our new products. Like, you don't ever want to just be like, oh, yep, this is the one. This is going to be my forever product, and I'm going to retire on this product because that's a good way to get bit in the butt. So product discovery is still going on. But for our main production product lines, we had a winning set of market segments. We had a winning addressable market. We had a winning operations back end. We had all these things, but where we were really starting to hit friction was in the scalability of, essentially, like the sales team, and how the sales teams and the marketing teams and the operations teams who actually were maintaining delivery was how they were able to actually share the data and maintain customer satisfaction. That was essentially a system refactoring project. In the early days of getting the product off the ground, we were in those days using a kind of a purpose-built internal software system to manage the product, and we had built like a bunch of kind of homegrown pieces of middleware that wired together the product data with what we were equipping the sales team with. So the sales team needed access to a lot of the data that was contained in the production system for the product, but we just kind of had to patch it, so there, the sales team would come to us in product management and say, hey, we need to understand this about the customer behavior so that we can better connect with our customers and sell more. And so then, we would kind of stand up a project to develop like a piece of middleware so we could get that data flowing back and forth. But that was all very ad hoc. And it was like a lot of baling wire and duct tape, as you can imagine, especially after a couple of years. So that was starting to get quite clunky. And while we were meeting the needs in real time as they came up, the system itself was just getting like gnarlier and gnarlier. So over time, you could see that we were actually starting to take a real efficiency hit. A lot of time and resources and energy was getting sucked more and more into the technical debt that was like creeping into a very meaningful amount. And then one last piece of the team was marketing, right? And like marketing really needed to be able to access information from the sales teams and from the product platform as well, so that they could communicate intelligently about it and write compelling messaging and support sales with their digital marketing campaigns and things like that. So I'm not going to name the product that we were using because nobody would ever recognize it. It's never been used outside of like this very niche domain that we were in. But ultimately, we decided after quite a number of painful cycles to make the transition to Salesforce. And so that was Salesforce is a very modular platform, and we were really fortunate to have on our team some really good developers who kind of they were able to wear multiple hats. They were cross-functional, which, just as an aside, this idea of a cross-functional team where you've got like a very tight group of people who have worked together for a while, and so they understand each other and they understand the needs, but they're all able to do kind of two or three different things. There's a lot of flexibility and elasticity in a team like that, but that only comes if you can keep a team happy and engaged and together, because it takes time to develop it, but it's well worth developing that capability. So we had a team like that, and so we had a lot of really smart, really adaptive and flexible development capability. And in that case, once we had made the initial Salesforce investment, then we were able to just start like it didn't happen all in one fell swoop. It was a refactoring process, or what we sometimes refer to in IT infrastructure circles as a strangler pattern. So if listeners have never heard of that, just look up the strangler fig and how that works, and you can see, or you can just look up like strangler pattern, and there's a lot of stuff on the internet about it. But it's this idea that you rebuild the system piece by piece, and then you swap out the new piece and then turn off the old piece, but you're not turning off the whole system and swapping it out with a brand new whole system. You're just doing it like in a modular way. So that's what we did. And we were essentially applying like the very same learning heavy product lifecycle mentality to our internal system. So this was interesting, right? Because it wasn't actually the market facing product at all. But and this is something that you run into in a lot of enterprise scale organizations, in which they actually have to employ product management principles just for internal, you even call them internal products, and a lot of people are calling them products more and more, even though it's not a product in the traditional sense, in terms of that's what you're going out to market with and selling to a customer. You have internal customers. In an enterprise scale organization, you've got thousands of internal technology customers that you have to serve. And so your product management lifecycle and how you learn to adapt and serve those internal customers just to keep the lights on and just to keep things running efficiently, is just as important, if not more so, than your market facing product. So anyway, that's what we did. It was a big Salesforce transformation. Our developers built bespoke features with the development tools that are in Salesforce's platform, one piece at a time. And they started with the requirements of the stakeholders. So the sales teams, the functional leaders, the operations teams, and what they needed to keep things running smoothly. And then the marketing and market facing teams as well. So that at the end of the day, not only was our Salesforce development team cross functional and adaptive and flexible, so that they could figure out what the requirements and the needs were in an iterative way, which they did that with short cycle times where they would learn a little bit and then they would figure out what the priorities were, and then they would focus in a short cycle time only on what is top of the priority, and the rest of it would kind of sit there on the backlog while they focused on what the most important priorities were. And we had measurement criteria and things like that we developed for those things based on our business situation at that time. And so, that lasted about a year, I would say. And then at the end of that year, we were able to turn off that old system and we were a full Salesforce system. And, Salesforce is a misleading name in this situation because it actually became it really became like the core beating heart of the business, because Salesforce, we started using that to manage all of our product metrics. We could actually do a little bit of development of customer facing sort of small p products in the platform with bespoke features that our development team built, and then we were able to measure and see with complete transparency. Any stakeholder from any team was able to see all those metrics. So if I wanted to go poke around in sales metrics, I could do that as a product manager. If sales, or probably more relevantly, like the marketing team, wanted to go in and see what product performance or product metrics was like, they could do that. So it just exposed all of the data and all of the information so that everybody had a common corpus of data that they were learning from. And it became very powerful. I mean, when I think about, we never really measured it quantitatively, but I've got to imagine like our efficiency saw huge gains, and just our overall speed, the speed with which we were able to deploy new features, the speed with which we were able to equip sales teams with good messaging or with good campaigns, and similarly for the marketing team, it just got so much faster and more efficient. And like after a while, we reached this point where that old system was kind of a thing of the past, and it was hard to imagine how we ever lived on that old system. So yeah, that's a custom Salesforce environment development example, but definitely like it paid big dividends, and it took some time, but man, it was super worth it. And the final piece of that is that everybody was just so happy because not only did we build the system that the business needed, but we built the system that the people needed. So all that frustration, all of those cycles where people were, trying to, like, spinning their wheels, trying to find one little piece of data that they needed, trying to collaborate in like a clumsy way across different functional departments to get what they needed. All of that inefficiency and frustration that came along with that was just gone. So now you had like excited, motivated teams who had what they need. And believe me when I say a team that has those feelings and dynamics going on is going to move a lot faster, be a lot happier. They're going to stay longer, and there's equity to that, and they're ultimately going to make a lot more money than a frustrated team.
Absolutely. And one of the only ways that we're now seeing, sorry, I'll just edit that part out.
Collect your thoughts.
I'm gonna
Collect your
collect my
thoughts.
thoughts. I'm gonna
No,
collect
don't
my
edit it
thoughts.
out. I want people to see.
Oh,
I want
good
them to
lord.
see the wheels turning. I want to hear the grind.
You hear you start to see smoke coming out of my ears. I'm glad I have these headphones on. Uh, um, I'm gonna come out and be honest with it. A lot of the products, especially, you know, subscription services and the tiny like ways that our economy has turned micro consumerist, or sorry, very consumerist in micro ways, microtransactions all across. It's all terrible. The quality of the products has gone down the hill. You don't own anything anymore. You can't repair anything anymore. And so in this drought of quality in the world, I like to make something better. And I know that you like to make something better. And I'm always hearing you talk about the importance of the user-centric design in in your sphere and in all spheres. And so I want to ask you how you use this to kind of enhance the learning experience and create a better product for the consumer?
Man, where did you get these challenging questions? So look, dude, first things first,
That's
right?
where the smoke comes from.
We have to make sure that we're not conflating um, different things. It's kind of a fundamental, like, Socratic process of defining our terms, right? So, like, the main term that we're orienting this product, or I'm sorry, this conversation around is the word product, and then product management. So, you, Toby, my young friend, you are talking about like consumer facing products that actually get delivered out and consumed by paying users. Certainly a very valid and kind of a traditional lens on what you think of as a product or service, and totally valid, right? So but I just want to make sure for our listeners, right, they're understanding that that's a particular type of product. That's a market facing product that's being consumed by an end user or end users, or maybe like an enterprise end user if it's a B2B product or something like that. But the thing that we're also talking about in this conversation is a little bit more like product as um, the idea of a product. It's the idea of what a product is. What does that mean? And a product is ultimately anything that meets a user or a customer's needs. You can't have a product, whether it's the type that you're talking about or whether it's one of the internal operational products or whether it's even like applying product management to the Salesforce transformation example that I just talked about. In that situation, those Salesforce features was our product. That was what we were managing the life cycle for, right? So um, you can deliver horrible, crappy quality for products and features like that internally to your end Salesforce users, and then you have like a really grouchy sales team or really grouchy functional business teams. That's bad. Or you can have the same bad situation to the type of end level like consumer customers for the types of retail products you're talking about, and that's really bad, right? And that really badness is kind of actually kind of what you're getting at, right? Like people are hooked onto some mediocre product. It's frustrating to them. Now at an enterprise level, most people will recognize that experience because IT gets all the frustration and the hate because they're forced to use a system to do their job that's really clunky or doesn't give them what they need. So, this idea of being really clunky and not giving you what you need is kind of at the heart of your question. It's a bad experience. So, yes, user centricity, customer centricity. Um, I think any successful business leader, certainly any successful product leader in, we're at the end of 2024 going into 2025. But at this point in time where we are, any successful product leader is always going to tell you that the key to success is customer or user centricity. So what does that mean? It means learning. So we bring it back to the idea of the thesis of this conversation, which is that your product is not bubblegum for kids here. Your product is not like toothpaste, right? Your product is going to be for a very specific need that probably the rest of the world has never heard of, for a certain user or customer group that probably most people in the mainstream don't even know exists. And the needs that they have are going to be needs that nobody would ever think of or even know about unless they're in that domain area. And that applies to the owner or the manager of the product as well. So again, if you think back to the lean startup cycle, one of the fundamental ideas here is that you have to have you have to internalize a comfort level and a confident ability to move forward while kind of like admitting to yourself that I don't actually understand my customer as well as I might think. Or just admitting that, hey, I'm responsible for this product, and I may know my side of the product development lifecycle really well, but I have to get comfortable with the idea that I probably don't understand my end customer user all that well. Now, people who are responsible for product delivery and product lines that get those like grouchy, frustrated customers, which is essentially what we would call it's the result of a low level of quality. Um, which is a decide, right? What is quality, right? Quality has lots of different definitions, but for our sake, I would say quality is the degree of alignment with the customer needs for what they need out of that. And so there's the happier your customer is, the higher your level of quality, and vice versa. So I have to say that, right? But those frustrated, grouchy customers that you're describing, they are fundamentally a result of people who are in charge of the product line who has not yet admitted to themselves that they are not necessarily the end all be all expert on their customer or user. So they have to adopt a learning mindset about their customer or user. So fundamentally, the idea of user centricity or customer centricity means applying a very similar um, lean startup cycle to understanding your customer and their needs. It means talking to your customers. It means getting out of your ivory tower and going out there into the market and having conversations. It means bringing customers and users into your development process at every level, and really internalizing with your development and your product management process what those needs are, right? Like fundamentally, the thing that you want to understand the most about your customers or users as you put them at the center of your process and your practice, is their needs. And needs are usually built on some kind of pain point. So I always say, like, it's ironic because the pain is basically the yellow brick road to a successful product. So follow the pain, go where the pain is. And we talked about prioritization. What do you prioritize from a feature and a customer centric development standpoint? You prioritize the thing that's the most painful. So figure out ways to measure your user or customer's pain, and then tie that pain to the needs. And now you start to have a clearer picture of how to prioritize the development plan. But yes, like fundamentally, it is a like customer or user centricity. It is synonymous with a certain type of learning mindset and a certain type of implemented learning practices. Learning is at the center of user and customer centricity, because what user and customer centricity fundamentally means is putting the understanding of your user and the ability to develop things that map to that understanding at the heart of your product development process. So to do that, you have to learn about your customers' needs, and that's easier said than done. So yeah, that's what I would say about it, right? Like user and customer centricity is the key to successful products that are going to delight your customers, that are going to keep customers sticky. If your customers are delighted and happy, that's going to grow your user base. It's going to grow your customer base, because you're going to have reputational equity, all the things that a product manager dreams about. They're all available to you if you can figure out how to build a disciplined framework for this user or customer centricity. But that is like, it's not just hand in hand with learning. It's literally like synonymous with baking a learning framework into how you manage the product and understand your customers.
100%. Um, and you talk about success and reaching success in that venture and in that manner. How do you measure success in learning initiatives? Where does success come from learning? Because it's obviously from learning, but that's a hard thing to quantify. How does that compare to measuring product success, like you were talking about before, like two different things?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I mean, it depends on the use case for one thing. Like I hate to always be saying it depends, but I mean, if you're measuring the implementation of an enterprise learning plan or something like that, like we've talked about in other episodes of this podcast, like if you think about the conversation we had with Katie a while ago, we talked at some length about KPIs for learning initiatives there. Product KPIs are related, but maybe a little different. The first thing I would say is, for one thing, make sure you're always measuring. Period. So if you're asking about what to measure, well, the first thing you should measure is how much are you measuring? Because sadly, again, we get into that situation where people think of themselves as the expert on the product, or more dangerously, as the expert on their customer. And so their opinions and their domain expertise plays a heavy role in judgment calls and how decisions get made, but it's not really necessarily informed by data. So are they actually measuring something, or are they just trusting their gut, even if their gut sometimes is valuable. So that's the first thing, right? Is like, are you actually measuring? Are you doing it in a repeated way? Are you taking the lessons contained in the data that's returned by what you measure, and are you actually baking those in a disciplined, cyclical way, repeatably, with similar time scales? You know, are you baking that into like the work cycles of the teams? Are you doing that, and how? So we're like measuring measurement in some ways. Now, in terms of what you measure, that's one of those dynamic things that's going to vary, right? So like that's, I think, and I'm not trying to say something that sounds like a cop out, but depending on what you're trying to achieve with what type of product it is and what type of segment it is that you're serving, you're going to measure different things, but you have to design those measurements. So now that I've got like the cop out, it depends side out of the way, there are a few things you can talk about that you probably always want to be measuring no matter what the situation is. So, one of the most important fundamental measurements, and heroes of mine like Eric Ries and Paul Graham and others, especially early in the product lifecycle, obviously one of the most important things you want to be measuring is your user count. So if you don't have users for your product, you don't have customers for your product. If people aren't consuming your product, then for one thing, your overall business trajectory is not going in the right direction. You're not going to make any money if you can't build that customer base. But you also don't have as rich of a resource pool to actually collect data on. So that's one of the like most fundamental things is just the number of users, and then what's the growth rate of those users, right? So if you've got 1.5 million customers out there, and you're growing, but you're growing at like a 0.01% rate, then you know what I mean? Like, is that enough to keep up with economic factors and stuff like that? Like, technically you're growing, but it's easy to start measuring vanity metrics that make yourself feel successful, and that let you go tell a successful story to your executives or something like that. That's really dangerous stuff. So your user count, the rate of your user growth, those are really important, especially early in the product lifecycle. As products get more mature, and but at other, all across the phase of the life cycle as well, the cycle time to develop a new feature or to develop a new product and get that deployed. What's the we in some tech circles we have a handful of metrics called the Dora metrics, and those metrics, you can look up Dora if you're not familiar with it. It's
Dora, Dora.
it's a framework that's been developed by some heroes of mine who sadly probably don't even know I exist, but they're awesome. Check them out. Check out the Dora metrics. But those metrics all kind of focus around a core set of things that you measure that have to do with essentially with speed. How fast are things corrected or fixed when something breaks? How long does that take, right? What's the lead time from green lighting a feature or a product, or some piece of functionality or some piece of the product supply chain that you're developing? How fast from making the commitment decision to delivery, how long does that take? Like, that is one of the most important things you can measure. Measuring the cycle time, mean time to delivery. And then when something breaks, like, what's the mean time to recovery? So those are types of metrics that they kind of like fundamentally measure like the overall health of how you're managing your business. So if you think about the way your doctor might measure things like your blood pressure, your heart rate, your blood lipids, your cholesterol, things like this. Like, that's always going to be the first stuff that they measure, even if you're going in for a broken arm or for diabetes or anything, right? Like, they're always going to measure those because those metrics inform the health of the overall system, so that if they start to have to drill down on some like specific area of the system that's not working well, they have to measure the baseline stuff first. So if we're thinking about baseline metrics that are going to be the type of stuff that you measure no matter what, those are some of the things, like user count, user growth rate. You can also measure things like customer delight, although that how you do that's going to vary. But yeah, like mean time to delivery from the time a feature, a product component is green lighted. Um, Mean time to recovery when something breaks, how long does it get fixed? Also, the number of features or product components that you deploy in a given amount of time is also indicative of agility, right? So, Amazon, for instance, famously has this example where, they gave this talk where they talked about basically going live or deploying what was it, Amazon or Meta, I can't quite remember, but it's famous in tech circles, and it was like 1,000 deployments per day. Whereas if you think about conventional enterprise scale organizations, and where we're talking about basically like tech products or features here, software products or features, an important subset of products, but for those most enterprise organizations, and this remains true to this day, but the ones that I've worked with, their average cycle time to deploy, like whatever they've greenlit, is usually like about a quarter or sometimes a half, right? So 3 months, 6 months. So it blew the audience away when these early adopters of this type of mentality said, we deploy to production 1,000 times each day. I mean, that was just like completely exotic. But
Wild.
if you start thinking about it, you're like way more flexible, you're way faster. You're also having to work in teeny weeny little increments, and that reduces your risk. If you have a 3-6 month cycle time and you deploy a broken product, or it breaks something in production, or something goes wrong, think about all that overhead. Like your team's been working on that for 6 months, and you probably just broke something really big. Versus if you're deploying 1,000 times per day, and a couple of those things are broken, probably nobody's even going to notice. You can you can just fix those things while the remaining 998 continue to deliver more value. Anyway, I know I get long winded about this stuff, but I think I
No,
just gave you four
I'm
or
happy to
five typical things.
let you ramble. It's good stuff. I would like to pedal back to heroes of yours, because you talk about a lot of really great people who have some really great ideas, and I wanted to focus in on Paul Graham, and ask you to highlight some of his philosophies, especially the ones that are most applicable to product management and also educational training.
Yeah, so I guess I would say, like, for one thing, let's put a note on the calendar to have a pod episode just about heroes, because I think that would be a pretty cool conversation.
That does sound like a good one.
I mentioned Eric Reese earlier in the chat. Um, some of the other people who heavily have informed me, I'm going to like give props to them because I talked about some of their ideas. Barry O'Reilly, Jez Humble, Don Reinertson, who really goes hard on this idea of prioritizing value measurements. If you want to understand what to measure, man, you should check out Don's book, Lean Product Development Flow. And check out those other guys. Jez and Barry and Joanne Molsky wrote a book called Lean Enterprise, which kind of explains what to measure and where in the product life cycle, early in the product life cycle, mature in the product life cycle. So a wealth of stuff. If you want to understand more about kind of some of where my ideas are coming from, check those folks out. So Paul Graham, who's Paul Graham? If you never heard of him, Paul Graham is the founder of a they're essentially like a venture capital firm, but kind of a new generation one called Y Combinator. So some people will recognize the name of Y Combinator. Um, if you do a quick Google search, some of the startups that Y Combinator has funded, among others, Airbnb, Dropbox, Stripe, um, lots of,
The
yeah,
first ever company to try and standardize high school American esports.
really.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I read a book about it. Of course I'm forgetting the name of the company, but
That's cool though, and we're going to talk about esports here sometime
yeah,
soon.
finally
So
get
anyway,
finally get one that I can ramble on.
yeah, I can't wait for that. I cannot wait. And I'm gonna give you so much hassle, and I'm gonna interrupt you so much. Oh, I'm so excited. Anyway, so Paul Graham founded Y Combinator. Y Combinator took a different approach, and actually, as I talk a little bit about Paul Graham, I'm gonna go back to that rant that I never quite made and talk a little bit about that, because the rant that I wanted to make was comparing the way that we are discussing early stage go to market and early stage product development and product discovery with kind of the conventional way that it's been done. And if you think about the conventional way that it's been done, like VC funded startup, um, the VCs are basically like you're going to VCs and you're asking them to write a really big check to fund your startup. So let's say you're going to try to solicit Series One funding, $20 million or something. That's a lot of money, right? So the VCs are going to lend you this $20 million, and they're usually really going to want to understand exactly what your product is, because that's a lot of money. It's a lot of risk. They want to feel really sure and confident that you absolutely have a winning formula. uh, and so there's a lot of due diligence, and there's a lot of business case analysis, and there's a lot of pitching, and like explaining exactly how you've figured out every little detail of your product. You've figured out every little detail of your market. You've got a plan. It's going to work from step one to step 2107, right? And you've got it all figured out. You've got it all documented. Well, for one thing, think about how much time and resources you've spent putting together that business case. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't put together a business case, and I'm not saying that any of this is wrong. I'm just saying that is super heavyweight. And then the VCs, they see all that and they write you that check, and it's really grueling. It's really intense. It's a long cycle time. It's a lot of money. That's kind of I don't want to make it sound negative, because people do that and it works, right? Whatever. But it's a little bit of the antithesis of the type of approach we're talking about, right? Now, so Paul Graham, to bring it back to him, he decided to do things in a bit of a different way. So at Y Combinator, the way that they would fund early stage startups is, for one thing, they would fund them in cohorts. So instead of a really big pitch for one really comprehensive, detailed idea, they would fund like 20 or 30 people, or like 10, 20, a couple dozen, whatever it is. I think sometimes their cohorts would be like 40 early stage founders all at once, and they would work with those cohorts all at once. So like they were funding a portfolio of startups rather than just making a really big giant bet on one startup with a bunch of money. And then at the same time, the funding was much smaller, right? So like in some cases, they may just be funding the founders for like $50,000 or $100,000 or something like that,
Hmm.
and then they're working with them very closely to incubate and get where they're going. And then basically the goal of all this is essentially to get you um, into a room with then your real legitimate early stage VC. So they're basically it's a way of working with cohorts of dozens of founders all at once to help them navigate the early stage go to market and get to that pivot or persevere moment that we're talking about. And the ones that Paul Graham and Y Combinator decided successfully get to that, they get to sit in a room with a panel of VCs and have their demo day, and then make that persevere, that commitment decision, and get serious VC to move and scale their business. But you can kind of see, right? So like hopefully you can see how that approach to VC and early stage startup, it's much more reflective of the mentality and the practices that we're talking about here, right? Like it's done in smaller cycles, it's diversified. And if you look into Paul Graham, you should check out his website, paulgraham.com. He's got a section on there called essays, and you can read all of this in his essays. They're super illuminating, but he kind of explains how by funding spreads of startups with lower amounts of funding per one, and then got like basically working with them to get to the launch point. His risk is diversified. So you've heard of Airbnb, you've heard of Stripe, right? Like you've heard of Dropbox. These are immensely successful companies. And then there's a bunch of failures baked in as well, right? Somewhere along the way, and you've never heard of those. And we talked about this some on our product testing episode a couple weeks ago. But the other thing that there is is a lot of companies that you've never heard of, which were actually quite successful. They just weren't full blown black swans like Airbnb was. But you've never even heard of these companies, but they've made millions of dollars for their founders. Their founders have grown quite rich, and their company's been quite successful. And Paul Graham and Y Combinator has. I mean, I don't even know. They probably have like hundreds of success stories like that in their portfolio. Um, but they're not the unicorns the way the ones that everybody knows about are, but they're very successful in their niche, in their segment. And so you can imagine like how rich Paul Graham is because of those types of diversified returns versus one big idea VC funded single startup that thinks they have it all figured out. And then they blow millions of dollars on fancy office space, and then companies are bust 2 years later because they weren't able to adapt fast enough. So that's Paul Graham. The other thing that I would share about Paul Graham, and I think we're probably coming up on our time here, but Paul Graham doesn't look at the all of those pages and pages of specifics of the business case to gauge whether or not an idea is going to succeed. He probably looks at some of that, but not in the way that the big heavyweight VC decision makers are that I'm talking about. He looks at the founders themselves, and he looks at them to see, like, have they actually found a problem that they know? Have they theorized about some business idea that they think is going to succeed out there? Or have they actually discovered a pain point that's in their lives and in the lives of their friends and colleagues that they realize there's a need for a solution here, and I can build a product around that, and I'm passionate about it, I believe in it, I know the pain, I know the person. So you can see kind of how that user centricity and customer centricity, that's like baked into the philosophy that Y Combinator uses, because to gauge the success, like, Paul Graham knows he doesn't know what the final product will look like, just like we talked about. So the thing, but and he explains this in his essays, and he says, for one thing, there's like no criteria you can actually look at, much less a 300-page business case before you write a $20 million check. But he says the closest thing that you can look at to kind of gauge whether or not something's going to succeed is kind of like, does the founder really have their hands around a super real problem that they understand, and are they dedicated and totally committed? Are they on fire to solve that problem? That's the kind of person he knows can persevere and eventually solve the problem and eventually find a good product. So that's kind of a very different template than kind of your traditional VCs. But those are a few thoughts about Paul Graham that I like a lot. And, it's been an inspiration to me for sure.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's gonna do it for this episode, folks. We'll close out with some final thoughts. I think maybe about the future, because everybody's terrified of it. Did you end up watching that slowly then all at once video
I
I sent
did.
you?
I did. Yeah.
Um, interesting times. Interesting times. What are you seeing in the emerging trends in product management, and where do you think we're going?
Man. Well, I mean, we've spent the whole hour kind of talking about a lot of that stuff. So,
True.
in terms of the trends and approaches that I personally believed are successful, it's a lot of the ideas and the examples that we've talked about here. Um, I think that if I kind of had to talk about one trend or idea to pontificate on the future, I think it would be get comfortable with uncertainty. Um, and just like Paul Graham and Y Combinator, there are a lot of founders and product owners out there who have been very successful and have made a lot of money either for themselves or for their company doing things the way that we have discussed. But you've never heard of them because there's such a long tail universe size of products and customer segments that are so niche, they're so specialty, right? But in a world that's as connected as ours, we've got almost 9 billion people or whatever in the world, you can have a really niche addressable market that's something most people have never heard of. And it's still, you know, 20 million people. You can make a lot of money selling to a marketplace of 20 million people. But you have to find that little subset. You have to find the pain, understand it, like we talked about. But you've got to embrace this idea of I'm navigating into unknown waters, and I'm okay with that because that's where the untapped treasure is. And I guess in terms of like trends for the future, it's kind of an exciting time because we've had enough time to actually formalize and codify repeatable management practices around that type of concept. So we've touched on just a very few of those things here, but lots of large organizations are beginning to appreciate that they want to transform to a product forward way of managing their value streams. There are frameworks out there, some good, some bad, for managing this way. And so that's a big trend that I see, is just that more and more, actually, even very large legacy enterprise scale organizations, sometimes just in pockets or sometimes with significant executive sponsorship, they're really beginning to embrace this way of managing products and prioritizing value. So there's a lot of precedent out there. There's learning going on out there in the marketplace, and most importantly, there's actual real examples of success stories that people are having with this. People are actually embracing this and beginning to use it more and more, which obviously, like, the world's only going to get crazier and more complicated with more unknowns, more uncertainty, more change. So if you don't have a sustainable set of management practices and product development practices that are like built to cope and adapt to that stuff, then you're not gonna be able to stay with the times. So it's a pretty encouraging trend that actually a lot of orgs actually are embracing this type of stuff.
Wow, well said. All right, folks. That's
Do you mean that?
all
Was that well said?
Do you want the compliment or not, Chris?
Okay, never mind. I'll take the win.
I think that's a good amount of blathering on for this week, and we will be back next week, folks, with either me getting to blather on about esports, my favorite thing, or a fun new guest. So,
and hey, don't just say it, not just esports, buddy. You built a product, and it was a learning product. So I'll just say those. I'll just say that. But it is relevant. It's not just esports. But yeah. So anyway, thanks for facilitating, Toby, and thanks everybody. Come on back next time when we pontificate on to whoever will listen.
The few that do.
All of our moms.
All of our moms.
All right, dude. Thanks for doing this.
All right. Absolutely. Have a good one, brother.
See ya.
Peace out.